The day had started like any other in the small town. The sun was high, people were out running errands, and the streets were busy with the usual chatter. No one expected anything unusual to happen, but life has a way of changing in a single moment. In the middle of that ordinary afternoon, a loud commotion broke out. People turned their heads as a heated argument escalated between a group of men and a police officer. What began with shouting quickly turned into pushing, and before anyone could stop it, the officer was struck and collapsed to the ground. The crowd gasped, frozen in place. Some covered their mouths in shock, while others pulled out their phones, too stunned to move. In that moment of panic, when everyone seemed unsure of what to do, a boy stepped forward. He wasn't older than his early teens, thin and small compared to the tall men around him. His heart pounded, but he didn't let fear take control. While adults stood back, afraid of getting involved, he rushed straight toward the injured officer. The officer lay on the ground, his breathing unsteady, blood staining his uniform. The boy knelt beside him without hesitation, using his hands to press against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. People around stared in disbelief. This child, who had no training and no strength compared to others, was the only one brave enough to take action when it mattered most. The boy whispered words of comfort, telling the officer to hold on, that help was coming. His voice shook, but he kept going. His small hands trembled, yet he refused to pull them away. The officer's eyes flickered, barely conscious, but there was a flicker of relief in them, as if he knew he was not alone. The boy looked around desperately, shouting for someone to call an ambulance, urging others to bring water, to do something. Slowly, a few people snapped out of their shock. Someone dialed emergency services. Another brought a jacket to place under the officer's head. But it was clear the boy was leading them all without even knowing it. The minutes stretched long, each second heavy with fear. Sirens in the distance began to wail, but until they arrived, it was only the boy holding back the tide of tragedy. The crowd whispered to each other, their voices filled with disbelief. "Look at him. He's just a kid," someone said. Another shook their head, tears welling in their eyes, amazed at the courage before them. A woman nearby muttered that if it weren't for him, the officer might not even make it until help arrived. Yet the boy didn't care about the whispers. His focus never wavered from the man on the ground, his determination stronger than his fear. Finally, the ambulance pulled up, lights flashing. Paramedics rushed in, quickly assessing the officer's condition. One of them paused for a moment, looking at the boy still pressing his hands over the wound, his clothes now stained red. They gently moved him aside, praising him for what he had done. "You gave him a chance," one of them said softly. The boy stepped back, his chest rising and falling quickly as the weight of what just happened hit him. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his face pale but filled with quiet relief. As the officer was lifted into the ambulance, the boy stood there, surrounded by people who couldn't stop staring at him. Some reached out to pat his shoulder, others whispered that he was a hero. Yet he didn't feel like one. He had only done what his heart told him was right. He couldn't stand there and do nothing while a life was slipping away in front of him. His young mind didn't think about danger, about consequences, or about the risk. He only saw a person in need and answered that call. In that moment, the entire street felt different. The noise of traffic seemed distant, the chatter of bystanders silenced by the image of a boy kneeling beside a fallen officer. It was a picture no one there would ever forget. The bravery of a child had filled the silence where adults hesitated. It was the kind of act that would stay in people's hearts long after the ambulance disappeared down the street. And though the boy didn't yet know it, this was only the beginning of a story that would shake the entire town. The sound of the sirens faded as the ambulance drove away, carrying the injured officer to the hospital. The boy stood there, his hands still stained, his heart still pounding from the rush of what he had just done. Around him, people murmured in awe. Some looked at him with admiration, whispering that he was the reason the officer was still alive. Others shook their heads in disbelief, as if they couldn't understand how a child had been braver than all the adults around. For a brief moment, the boy felt a flicker of pride, not for himself, but because he knew he had helped save a life. But that feeling was gone as quickly as it had come. Flashing lights returned to the street, this time with more police cars pulling up. Uniformed officers stepped out, their faces tight and serious, scanning the crowd for answers. People pointed toward the boy, and for an instant, he thought they were pointing to him as the hero. He expected words of thanks, maybe even comfort for what he had gone through. Instead, the officer walking toward him had a sharp look in his eyes. The boy felt the shift in the air, as if the very crowd that had been cheering seconds ago had suddenly gone silent without warning. The officer grabbed the boy by the arm. Confused, the boy tried to explain, his voice shaking, his words spilling out, that he had only helped. But the officer didn't listen. He twisted the boy around, pulling his hands behind his back, and before the boy could understand what was happening, cold metal cuffs snapped shut on his wrists. The boy froze, his chest tight with fear. The crowd gasped, their voices rising in shock. "Wait, that's the boy who saved him!" Someone shouted. Another woman stepped forward, waving her arms, insisting they were making a mistake, but the officer ignored them. His voice was stern, his words cutting through the growing noise. He said the boy matched the description of someone involved in the earlier fight, someone who had caused the chaos in the first place. The boy's eyes widened, his mouth opened, but no words came out. How could this be happening? Just minutes ago, he had been kneeling by the officer's side, fighting to keep him alive. Now he was being treated like a criminal. His stomach twisted and his body felt heavy, almost numb, as he realized the hands that had tried to save a life were now bound like a prisoner's. People in the crowd began to shout louder. Some pleaded for the boy's release, swearing they had seen him run to help, not harm. Others pulled out their phones, recording every second, their voices mixing with the flashing lights and harsh commands. Yet there were also those who stayed quiet, their faces unreadable. A few even nodded slowly, as if they believed the police must know what they were doing. To them, the boy was no longer a hero, he was a suspect. The boy looked around desperately, hoping someone would step forward to defend him. His chest tightened when he realized no one dared to stand too close. Some clutched their children and pulled them back, afraid of getting involved. Others whispered, afraid that if they interfered, they too might be accused. The boy's heart pounded harder than it had when he was saving the officer. At least then, he knew he was doing the right thing. Now he didn't even know what was happening, only that every eye in the crowd was fixed on him, some with sympathy, some with doubt, and some with fear. Tears stung his eyes, but he fought them back. He didn't want them to see him cry, not after what he had just done. His voice finally broke through the noise, trembling but strong enough to carry. He said he had only helped, that he wasn't part of the fight, that he didn't even know those men. But the officer holding him didn't loosen his grip. Instead, he pushed the boy toward the car, saying it would all be sorted out at the station. Those words offered no comfort. To the boy, it sounded like the beginning of something even worse. The crowd shifted, torn between outrage and silence. A man shouted that this was unfair, that the boy deserved thanks, not cuffs. A few joined him, their voices rising together, but the officers stood firm, their hands on their belts, their faces set like stone. The boy felt the weight of every step as he was led away, his feet dragging against the ground. He glanced back at the spot where it all started, where the officer had fallen, where he had knelt in the dust with his hands pressed against the wound. That moment of bravery now felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath the crushing reality of what was happening. As the car door closed on him, the sound of the crowd muffled, replaced by the pounding of his heartbeat in his ears. He stared through the glass, his eyes wide and wet, watching as people argued on the street. Some pointed at him, shouting for his freedom, while others shook their heads, already convinced of his guilt. The boy pressed his forehead against the cool window, his chest tight with fear and confusion. He had done the right thing, yet here he was, locked inside a car as if he were the very danger he had tried to stop. And deep down, he wondered if the truth would ever be enough to set him free. The next morning, the story had already spread through every corner of the town. What had started on a single street had now become the topic on every phone, every doorstep, and every dinner table. Some people couldn't stop praising the boy's courage, calling him a hero who acted when no one else dared. Others shook their heads, saying there must be more to the story, that the police wouldn't have arrested him without reason. The town was no longer quiet, it was divided, buzzing with arguments that cut through friendships, neighbors, and even families. Videos taken by witnesses circulated quickly, showing the boy rushing to the fallen officer, his small frame pressed against the wound, shouting for help. Many who watched it were moved to tears, their voices trembling as they shared the clip, saying the boy had saved a life. How could anyone arrest him after that? They asked. Yet alongside those clips were whispers that perhaps the police knew, something the public didn't. Maybe he had been involved before the cameras turned on, some people argued. Maybe he had tried to hide his role by pretending to help. Suspicion grew in certain corners, feeding doubt where there had once been admiration. Shops, schools, and offices hummed with the same heated debate. At the local cafe, customers leaned over tables, their voices low but passionate. One man insisted he had been there and seen the boy act without hesitation, that there was no way he was guilty. Across from him, another shook his head, saying that kids sometimes hide darker sides, and the police must have had their reasons. At the schoolyard, children argued too, some proudly claiming they would have done what the boy did, while others nervously said they were glad they hadn't been there at all. The boy's neighbors spoke in hushed tones, remembering how he often helped others, how he carried groceries for the elderly or looked after younger children when no one else would. To them, this arrest made no sense. But there were still those who questioned it. A few muttered that maybe the boy had gotten mixed up with the wrong people. Maybe bravery and guilt had tangled together in ways they couldn't yet see. The doubt was painful, splitting the community into two groups, one that saw him as a savior, and one that feared he might be something else entirely. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it across screens with dramatic headlines. Boy saves officer, then arrested town in shock. Clips of the rescue played side by side with images of him being led into the police car. Anchors debated the meaning, asking experts about how young people could be misunderstood, about the dangers of rushing to judgment, and about the trust people placed in authority. Social media burned with comments. Some poured out support, writing that the boy was a symbol of courage, proof that kindness could exist even in the youngest hearts. Others wrote harsh words, accusing him of trickery, of being part of the violence, and of trying to cover it up. The boy, meanwhile, sat in a small cold room at the station, cut off from the storm outside. He didn't know how much people were arguing about him, how his name had become a spark that divided the town. All he knew was the silence around him and the weight of being treated like a criminal. His thoughts replayed the scene again and again, the officer falling, the rush of fear, the desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. He wondered if anyone would believe him, if anyone would see the truth of what really happened. Back in town, people who had been there that day tried to make their voices heard. An elderly woman spoke up, saying she had watched the boy run in first, his face filled with nothing but fear and determination. A shopkeeper who had been near the scene swore that he had seen the boy earlier, that day helping a little child cross the street. Yet even with these accounts, not everyone was convinced. Some demanded proof. Others dismissed it as people being emotional. The division grew sharper with every passing hour. Friendships that had lasted for years cracked under the weight of disagreement. Some refused to speak to each other, while others argued openly in the streets. It seemed as though the boy's act of bravery, instead of uniting the town in pride, had instead pulled it apart in suspicion and doubt. As night fell, the boy's story continued to spread far beyond the town. Strangers from other places shared their opinions online, choosing sides without ever knowing him. His name was on the lips of thousands, but he himself felt smaller than ever, sitting alone, wondering if the truth of his actions would ever shine through. And while some prayed for his freedom and justice, others turned their backs, convinced that the system must be right. The boy's fate was no longer just his own. It had become the test of a town's conscience, the test of how far people would go to stand by what they knew was true. Days passed, and the boy remained behind closed doors, waiting for someone to finally believe him. His small frame seemed swallowed by the hard chair in the station, his eyes tired from sleepless nights. He replayed the moment over and over, the officer collapsing, the rush of blood, his own hands pressing down to keep him alive. The memory haunted him not because he regretted it, but because that same moment of courage had somehow turned into chains on his wrists. Outside, however, things were beginning to shift. The truth, like a faint light in the distance, started to flicker through the darkness that an elderly woman was the first to step forward. She had been right there when it happened. She remembered the boy pushing through the crowd before anyone else dared to move. Her voice shook as she described what she saw, but her words were clear. "He wasn't part of it," she said firmly. "He saved that man. I saw it with my own eyes." Her statement stirred something in the town. Those who doubted began to hesitate, and those who supported the boy grew louder, determined to prove him innocent. Soon after, a local shopkeeper came forward. He remembered seeing the boy earlier that same day. He recalled how the boy had helped a little child who was lost near his store, walking him back to his mother with a soft smile. The shopkeeper's words painted a picture of a child who was kind and thoughtful, not one who would harm anyone. His account was simple but powerful, spreading quickly through conversations and news reports. The idea that such a boy could suddenly turn into a criminal began to sound less believable. Then came something no one could argue with: footage. A security camera from a nearby building had captured the scene. The grainy video showed the officer falling, the crowd freezing, and the boy breaking free from the onlookers to run straight to him. The image of his small body bending over the fallen man, pressing his hands firmly to stop the bleeding, spoke louder than any words could. There was no sign of him starting trouble, no sign of him causing harm. The truth was caught on camera, undeniable and clear. But even with all this, the boy still sat in silence behind those walls. The system moved slowly, dragging its feet, as if unwilling to admit it had made a mistake. The crowd outside grew restless. People who had once whispered now began to raise their voices. They gathered near the station, holding signs, chanting for justice, demanding the boy's release. Some cried openly, saying he reminded them of their own sons or brothers, and that they couldn't stand to see him treated this way. What had begun as a quiet division in the town was now turning into a wave of unity, pressing harder with each day. The officers inside could no longer ignore it. The boy's name filled every headline, his story reaching beyond the town to distant places. Strangers who had never met him wrote messages of support online, calling him brave, calling him pure-hearted, calling him a victim of injustice. And yet, behind all the noise, the boy sat alone, his eyes heavy, his hands folded together as if in prayer. He wondered if anyone would listen to the truth, if anyone in power would have the courage to admit they were wrong. The officer whose life he saved lay in the hospital, slowly recovering. He had been unconscious for days, unaware of the storm outside. But as he opened his eyes and learned what had happened, his heart filled with disbelief. The boy, the one who had given him a chance to live, was being punished instead of praised. Weak but determined, he asked to speak, to tell the truth himself. His voice carried the weight of a man who had looked into the eyes of death and found life again because of a child's hands. Still, the walls of the system held strong, as if pride mattered more than justice. The boy's faith wavered, but the people's voices grew louder. They would not be silent anymore. The truth was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was out in the open, pressing against every barrier, waiting for the moment it would finally break through. The question was no longer whether he was innocent. It was whether those in power would have the courage to admit it. And so the boy sat, his spirit fading but not yet gone, unaware that outside, hope was building like a storm ready to break. The truth was coming closer with every passing hour, and soon it would no longer be possible to keep him locked away. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the town hall as a large crowd gathered outside, their voices echoing with one message: justice. What had begun as whispers of doubt had grown into chants that shook the streets. The boy, once hidden away behind walls, was now the center of the town's conscience. His story had touched not only his neighbors, but strangers from faraway places who read about him, watched the videos, and felt the injustice in their hearts. The truth could no longer be silenced. Inside the hospital, the officer whose life the boy had saved finally stood strong enough to speak. His body was still weak, his voice softer than before, but his words carried the weight of truth. Surrounded by reporters and townsfolk, he told them everything. He described how he had fallen, how the world blurred, and how the only face he remembered in that terrifying moment was the boy's. He spoke of the pressure on his wound, the trembling hands that never gave up, the voice urging him to hold on. And then, with tears gathering in his eyes, he said the words that changed everything. He saved my life. He is not guilty, he is a hero. The declaration spread like fire. The people outside erupted in cheers and cries of relief. Families hugged each other, some wiping tears as they realized the truth had finally been spoken by the very man who owed his life to the boy. Even those who had doubted before now lowered their heads in shame, realizing how quickly they had judged without knowing the whole story. The crowd's division melted into unity, their voices now together, demanding not just the boy's release, but recognition of his bravery. At the station, the boy sat quietly, staring at the floor, unaware of what was happening beyond those walls. When the door finally opened and the officers stepped in, his heart pounded in fear, thinking they had come with more accusations. Instead, the cuffs were removed. He looked up in confusion, his wide eyes searching their faces for answers. One officer cleared his throat, his voice stiff but softer than before. "You're free to go." For a moment, the boy didn't move. He couldn't believe it. Then slowly, he stood, his small shoulders carrying both relief and the weight of everything he had endured. Outside, the sunlight was brighter than he remembered. The crowd roared the moment they saw him, their voices lifting him higher than he thought possible. People clapped, some called his name, others simply wept. Strangers reached out to touch his hand, to thank him for what he had done. The boy, overwhelmed, lowered his head, feeling shy under all the attention. He had never asked to be a hero, he had only done what his heart told him was right. The officer, still recovering but determined, made his way to the front of the crowd. His uniform looked worn, his steps unsteady, but his eyes shone with gratitude. He knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "I owe you my life," he said simply. The boy's lips parted, but no words came. The silence between them spoke louder than anything else. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the truth, finally standing tall for all to see. In the days that followed, the boy's story traveled far beyond the town. Newspapers called him the boy who saved a life. News anchors praised his courage, and people across the country shared messages of support. Yet the boy remained humble, returning to his simple life, his heart still carrying the memory of those dark hours when no one believed him. He smiled politely when people thanked him, But inside, he knew the true lesson wasn't about being called a hero. It was about how quickly people could turn, how trust could crumble, and how hard it was to stand alone against suspicion. The town, however, changed because of him. Neighbors who had argued made peace, realizing they had been too quick to doubt. Teachers told his story in classrooms, reminding children that bravery isn't about age or size. It's about listening to your heart when others are frozen in fear. Even the police department issued a statement acknowledging the mistake, promising to listen more carefully before rushing to judgment. Though words couldn't erase what the boy had gone through, they marked the beginning of something better. The boy himself walked through those same streets again, no longer with fear, but with quiet strength. People greeted him differently now, with warmth instead of suspicion. He had faced the worst kind of unfairness and come out stronger, proving that truth and courage can survive even the harshest storms. His act of saving a life became more than just one moment. It became a reminder to everyone that even in a world quick to judge, goodness could still shine through. And so the story of the boy who saved a life, but nearly lost his freedom, lived on. Not as a tale of pain, but as one of redemption and change. The town would never forget him. His bravery, his suffering, and finally his vindication became part of its heart, a lesson etched into every street and every home. He had given them more than just a heroic act. He had shown them the power of truth, the danger of doubt, and the unshakable strength of a single human heart.